Good day to you. And here it is, your book for the course. Have you developed a personal relationship with this book? Is it something you carry around almost like a teddy bear? Yeah, I don't mean that facetiously. I mean, something that brings comfort in knowing that you are prepared for your quiz, and something that you can also hold at the same time, like a teddy bear. That's one of the properties of a book. Are you into the book? Or are you still distant from the book? Do you have the book? When I listen to people speak who are not big readers, and this is not meant to be any kind of condescending statement, they have a hard time in two areas. One is getting a handle on vocabulary. That is to say, if you follow people across campus, sometimes they're saying things like, this fucking guy was fucking, I didn't know what the fuck to do. And it's like, even that word like is an example of not being able to find the handle on words to express yourself. That's one of the problems with people I see who are not reading. The second problem is there is a level of thought that is just not possible with any other medium. That level of thought is achieved by going line by line and building those lines into paragraphs in your mind, building those paragraphs into chapters, building those chapters into an entire thought process known as the book. In other words, reading books allows you to dissect problems in life according to a precision that is just not possible had you not been a reading person. So this is my way of introducing what we're taking on today. We are taking on the very first technology of mass media in this class, and it's the book. And we're going to spend the next few classes, now that we're moving away from media effects and media as a business, where we set up a big global framework for media and how they operate. Now we're going to be moving into the history of the development of several innovations, several technologies that have led to mass media and ultimately mass culture, which is what we're talking about today in the context of the book. So let's continue on with the book. The book is the oldest medium. It's the oldest medium we're going to talk about in the class. It's a very private medium, right? It's not necessarily a social medium. It can be in college classes, but mostly when we read a book, we do it to ourselves. And we read books privately. And a lot of times the reason that we read books is because we know that the information that we're reading will not be learned by anybody else. I mean, 50 Shades of Grey served as a great way for women to learn about how to explore their sexuality in their teenage years, for example. So the book is a very, very private medium. It's also a source of entertainment. You may not think of it that way because people today, it's very difficult to read books. Books are not in our faces like they used to be. Books have many competing media, especially the phone. So it's very, very tough to get into a habit of reading today, but some people do read books. I know there are people in this class who are reading a book for pleasure right now. I know I am. I'm reading Walk This Way, which is about the band Aerosmith from the 1970s, my favorite rock era. And I'm really loving some of the stories that are being told by Steven Tyler and Joe Perry. It's entertaining to me, that book. But there is no other medium other than the book that requires the concentration that it requires, that is read alone, that requires logic, that requires reflection. Yeah, pausing and looking up. Let me think about what that sentence just means. That's the book. And it requires you to look up words, right? It requires you to look up words. It's one of the problems with reading a book. It doesn't have hypertext in it like web pages where we can look up words. Nevertheless, the book remains an important medium. Otherwise, we wouldn't be assigning it in college classes, and that's why I assign it in my college class. It's the only way that I know that we can really drill down into mass media with the kind of precision that we need to drill down into. So now let's go on to some of the history of books. Let's talk about before we get to books, we have to talk about writing, right? Where did writing come from? So you may not be aware, but prior to right around 5,000 years old, people were speaking and not writing. There was no written language. Yeah, and there are still, by the way, tribes in Africa that have no written language. I went to Ghana and I met people from several of these tribes, and there's no way you can have a newspaper or a book in these tribes. And that's the way that life was before the alphabet came along. The alphabet came along around 3500 BC in the Middle East, whereas the written language is around 5500 5,500 years old. It's around 5,500 years old. That's what it makes the written language. And just so that we can start to compare how fast media technology inventions have been accelerating over time, we're going to get to that later on in the course when we see the rapid pace developments that are going on iPhones and iWatches and holograms happening in a short space of time. With books, we're starting to see an acceleration, but nothing like we see today. So here's what I mean by that. The spoken language, when human beings started to use their mouths to speak, is about 40,000 years old. 40,000 years old, our spoken language. The written language is only 5,500 years old. So we were speaking for 35,000 years without having something to write with. Pretty amazing when you think about it. And what did writing do for us? It transformed us, just like all the technologies we're going to talk about in this class. Writing, for example, allowed information to be stored for the first time. I mean, you take it for granted. If you go to the grocery store, somebody's texted you exactly what they want. You can look it up on your phone. That wasn't the way things were before a written language. You had to memorize it all up here. And so our memories were much better, actually, 40,000 years ago. And today they're even worse because cell phones store so much information. We don't have to put it up here. I mean, how many of you know the phone numbers of your friends by heart? Not many, because they're in your contacts. So today people don't have to memorize as much. Now let's trace the origin of the alphabet. It doesn't start out with letters. The first thing it starts out with is the pictograph. I have a link for that, the pictograph. The pictograph is the earliest form of writing. It consists of pictures, and the context was cave walls. Human beings dwelling in caves, not yet advanced enough to build houses, afraid of the wildlife that's out there, and so they communicate with each other about using pictures of cattle, pictures of people using a bow and arrow to capture cattle. You can see that in the link that I see. It's most of the writing was about helping human beings to survive by knowing the cycles of nature and when you can harvest crops and when you can kill animals and how to kill animals so that you can survive. That's what the pictograph was doing. Now, some Asian languages, including Chinese, still use the pictograph. They still use pictures as part of their written language. And one of the forms of the pictograph is called the ideograph. Like an idea, the ideograph. Ideograph. It's an abstract symbol that stands for an object or an idea. You can see the Chinese character for life in the links that I've sent out to you today, and that's an example. You can kind of see life in the figure, right? That is an ideograph. It's an abstract symbol. Like life is really abstract, right? It's not like this remote control you can see and hold. It's something you have to visualize here, and that's represented. Now we can represent abstraction by pictographs. Later on, another form of writing was phonography. Phonography, it's a system of writing in which symbols stand for sounds. Now, we eventually get that with the letter A, right? The letter A stands for the sound ah or a, depending on what context the sentence is. But that's the idea of phonography. It's a system of writing where the symbols that you're writing are now sounding. They now are meant to have a sound with how they are. And that's how we eventually get the alphabet, where the letters represent individual sounds. And the alphabet was developed only in 1500 BC. 1500 BC, that's how recent the alphabet is. All right, so now we have a means of writing. Now we need a technology of what are we going to put the writing on, and that's where paper comes in. Let's talk about paper and how that has developed. And we know in the beginning writing that I talked about today was on cave walls, right? But cave walls you can't move. They're not portable. So the next thing to come along as a medium for writing on is the clay tablet. You know, just like Moses supposedly descended from the mountains with 2 clay tablets. Yeah, and the clay tablet is looking very much like the shape of a cell phone today, right? So we're going to see those kinds of forms of development throughout our study of mass media in this course. We're going to see some forms looking like other forms. A cell phone actually looks like a tablet, at least in its shape and its format today. Tablets were clay tablets, but, you know, they break. Once you put words on them, they're chiseled in. You can't erase them. They're heavy to carry. Okay, so they made writing more portable, but not as portable as papyrus. Papyrus comes along next. Got a link for that. Papyrus is made from reeds. Reeds are like bamboo, and so you take the sheath off, you get rid of the water, you press it all together, and you make papyrus. Papyrus. It was a primitive form of paper that was It was founded in 3100 BC in Egypt, 3100 BC, long before the alphabet, right? It was papyrus. Okay, but it would break up. It was not very sturdy. Once it dried out, it would fall apart, tough to make. So the next thing that comes along is parchment. Also, there's a link for that. Parchment is made from goat skin. So you dry out the goat skin, then you can write on that. So we're seeing media develop in terms of what you can write on, but finally, it was the Chinese. The Chinese in 200 BC, invented paper. And the paper comes from the bark of trees. So now we have everything in place for writing to take place in a pretty mobile way, pretty expedited, quick way. I mean, relatively speaking, because the original writing that was done of books are now starting to be writing, people putting pages together because of the paper, binding those pages, having the pages the same dimension so you can flip them. And now we start to have development of the book. And the first places to produce books were scriptoria. Scriptoria were monasteries where monks lived, and in those monasteries they wrote religious texts. They would copy them by hand. And each book would take about 5 years to produce. You know how careful you have to be? You don't have the ability to erase or delete. If you make one wrong letter, you have to throw the whole page away and start all over again. So 5 years to write a book, took forever to write a book. And finally, that brings us to the most important invention in the history of mass media. The most important invention, I previewed this earlier for you, and it is the Gutenberg printing press. Gutenberg printing press. And what the printing press was, first of all, let me give you a date on it. It was Gutenberg printing press. Sorry, I thought I had that in my notes here. I'm looking it up quickly on my line here. The printing press. Yeah, the 1400s, Gutenberg invented the printing press. The 1400s, a long time ago. What was the printing press? You can see a picture of it. You can see a video of it. It allowed a human being to use a machine to stamp out pages that could be put into a book or could be put into what would later become newspapers. So the printing press was the most profound invention to take place because now all of a sudden it made it possible to spread messages to masses of people. No longer would people have to go inside a cave and read what was on the cave or talk to a storyteller. Now we could print paper and spread it all over. Gutenberg was a metal worker in Germany. That's where he was from, and he was experimenting all the time with inventions. And he came up with this idea of movable type, and that's where you can move letters around and stamp them out onto a page. And later on, we start to get the development of those letters into further forms because they're being mass produced. For example, fonts start to be developed. Fonts, something that you know very well today, like Calibri or New York Times or Gothic or whatever the font is that you're using. Font is a Latin word that means mountain of type. Mountain of type, that's where that word is coming from. And then we also get italics. Italics sounds like Italian, right? And that's because they came from an Italian printer called Aldus Manutius in 1501. And we use italics today for lots of things. One of the things is which we use it for is to express this is the title of a book. When we put it in italics, it's the title of a book. So what does all this mean? Why are we calling the Gutenberg printing press the most important invention in the history of mass media? It's because it led to the invention of mass culture itself, of mass culture. The printing press started mass culture in 1490. So we had standardized books. The book that you're reading today is the same book that everybody else in the class is reading. There's no differences in handwriting style or content or pictures. It's all the same. Everything gets standardized. And new languages, therefore, started to emerge. You didn't need oral languages. You could have a language that was in very strict and written form, and you had punctuation to it. German was an example. The printing press accelerated the spread of German, and grammar and punctuation became standardized. I mean, not across all languages. Like if you use Spanish, for example, you can use an exclamation point, I think you can in Spanish, at the front of the sentence and also at the end of the sentence in Spanish. And we don't do that in English, but still the exclamation point means emphasis, so we do have that. But here is where we can really hit home with the printing press, because it is mostly responsible for what is known as the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation was where people who were starting to read the Bible, which was now made available to them because of the printing press. Prior to that, people had to go to the priest to find out what the Word of God was. Now people are going to read about the Bible. If you believe in God, I don't personally believe in God, but people who believe in God, they can access the Bible, and then they have access to the deity, and they have access to religious preachings. And so this pretty much diminished the role of the priest. And that's where you get Lutheranism and British Anglicanism. I think I'm saying that right. They're saying we don't need to go through the priest to get to God because we've got this printed copy of a book called the Bible. Not all books, though, were religious in the early form. Ben Franklin, talked about Ben Franklin last class. Ben Franklin actually opened a library, one of the first libraries in Philadelphia in 1731. In 1731, he opened a library. It's very different from the kind of library we have today. The library for Ben Franklin was a subscription-based service. You had to pay a subscription, and then you would go in there. And it wasn't for everybody. It was only for people who were wealthy, elite, and who could read, because not everybody could read yet. We'll get to that later. Other early books were on Richard's Almanac, which was another Ben Franklin production. We still look at it today. It predicts what the yields of crops are going to be. And other books included animal husbandry. Catch that phrase? Interesting, right? Animal husbandry is a very patriarchal term with husband, but it's taking care of animals. You need to, because you don't survive if you don't eat. You're not going to go down shopping at Giant because there is no Giant. Agriculture was another subject covered by books, and the military. So now we come back to industrialization, because the printing press was just another example of industrialization taking place across the world, where people were starting to build machines that could make goods, and those machines were being housed in factories, and those factories were in cities, and people are moving from small rural areas, farm communities, into the cities to break away from their prior, I guess, fixed life, where if your dad was a barrel maker, you're going to be a barrel maker. If your mom was a homemaker, you're going to be a homemaker. People said, no, there are jobs in the city because of the factories, so we're going to move there. So industrialization changes our country radically, as well as other countries. You have only to go to Philadelphia today and look around some of those areas, Kensington and other areas. Those are areas that are formerly factory areas where tenement housing was built. People lived in squalid conditions, next door to neighbors who they didn't really know. They were not next to the same person they grew up in the town with. So this is the environment in which book production starts to grow, because people start to seek ways of entertaining themselves when they get home from the factory. They want books. Books are also being produced in a mass way. So the very first paperbacks start to be produced. And then later, dime novels, kind of like the penny press. Dime novels, because the cost of production came down. Dime novels are, what we'd consider romantic novels, or what are they called today? There's another name for them. I can't quite. Vanity books today. So, and in the midst of this, the Gutenberg printing press gets motorized, because the steam engine gets put in there, and now it's a pumping steam engine. You can also see an example of that in the links today. So along comes another person who contributes to this invention. He's a German as well. His name is Mergenthaler. 1885 is the year, and he developed what's known as the linotype typesetting machine. And that's basically adding a keyboard to the printing press so that you can type the words and move them around and produce much faster. And so this spurred not only the mass production of books, but democracy itself and literacy itself, which is necessary for democracy. Everybody needs to be informed as much as possible for democracy to function. And one of the ways that you could do that, perhaps the best way at that time when there's no web, no radio, no TV, is through books. So people started to read, and especially since the cost comes down to a dime novel, now you have more and more people reading. So going alongside with this, you have the growth of a brand new industry, a brand new media industry, and that is the publishing industry. And in the publishing industry in the 1900s, the early 1900s, last century, books started to become big business. Publishers started to become big companies. Publishers are companies that buy manuscripts from authors and turn them into books. I've had 2 books published. You're reading one of them for the class. It's very important that my students have access to my ideas. That's one of the reasons that I assign Rounding Some Corners. But I also have another book called Comparing Media from Around the World, and I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later. But I don't own that book. The publisher bought it from me, and they pay me royalties, $4.50. I think sum total for that book, I made $600 over 10 years. It wasn't written to make money. I just want to make that clear. It was written to get my ideas out there. So we have publishers rising up, big companies, and we have several different kinds of publishers. We have university presses, like Penn State has a press, Rutgers has a press. We have small presses, like Rounding Some Corners is with Fountainhead Press. If you're interested in that publisher, go look them up. They're very ecologically friendly. Fountainhead is a small publisher. And we have the rise of publication firms. The biggest printer of books, you might be surprised about, is the government printing office. It's the government printing office. They do all the IRS documents. They print the laws of the land. They print lots of policy on coronavirus, etc. So this also gave rise, the rise of the publishing industry, gave the rise of a person of a special status as an author, right? If you know an author, it's like, that's a big thing, right? Not as big as it was in the past, maybe not as big as a YouTube influencer, but an author is somebody who was held in high esteem. And that author goes through a publishing experience, and often it involves you're going to get an advance to write a book. That's what I got for my book, Comparing Media from Around the World. I got $3,500 from the publisher. It was to be used for my travel to interview people, because my book was on media from around the world. So I went to Ghana, I went to Mexico. Let me tell you, that money soon ran out. I went to France, I went to Sweden, interviewing government regulators, media professionals. At least that's how it worked in my book. Now let's go on to booksellers and distribution consolidation. So the biggest book company that sends books all over the world as a wholesaler is the Ingram Book Company, INGRAM. Most people don't know about that. It's that company that's supplying books to the retailers like Barnes and Noble. But Barnes and Noble is really about the only, except for small town booksellers, about the only brick and mortar selling place that's still there. Mostly it's Amazon, right? And anybody can publish a book on Amazon. You can publish a book on Amazon. They have software that allows you to publish a book. It's just that once it's on there, how do people find it? And how do people start to read it and spread the word? It's very, very difficult. Now we also have the textbook business. That's a business that you know very well, a very expensive business. I cringed when I saw the cost of this 7th edition book, knowing that there's an 8th edition out there. I was really bummed out to have to assign this one, but the book is so important. I did that for the class. I hope you understand I didn't take the cost of this book lightly. Hopefully some of you got rented books, or I'm not even sure I agree with that, because then you don't even end up with anything, or used books. But the textbook business comes along, and the average college student, according to our book, is spending $1,344, it's a very specific figure, $1,344 on technology and supplies every semester, and about $646 of that dollars is books. That's how much the average college student is paying. But the secondhand book market has come on strong. Rented books have come on strong, and ebooks have come on strong. Amazon Kindle, Fire, etc. But there's really nothing that substitute for holding the book. You take this down the beach, totally different. I don't mean this book, not that you take this down the beach, but take a book down the beach. You can't substitute for that with an Amazon Kindle. It's not the same, and that's why the Kindle is actually trying to mimic page turns in the software transition to make it feel like a book. Now let's go on to talk about books and censorship. Censorship has been pretty prevalent in books. Books even like Catcher in the Rye, which you may have read, or The Scarlet Letter, which you may have read in public school. Those are very important books in U.S. culture. Those books were banned. They were banned. Where were they banned? Mostly in the United States, mostly at the level of local libraries. Local libraries not wanting Catcher in the Rye or Grapes of Wrath, or I don't know if you know these books, but they concern sexuality. They concern, in many cases, young people in drugs, not necessarily in these books. They concern slights against religion. Salman Rushdie, I don't know if you know that name, that author. He's from Iran. He wrote a book called Satanic Verses, criticizing Islam. There was a notice of death put out on him for years and years to try and get him to stop writing that. And I think he's still in hiding. So we have had quite a history of book banning in our country, including The Scarlet Letter, which I've mentioned. Of Mice and Men was banned. Twelfth Night by William Shakespeare, which promotes homosexuality. And Forever, a more modern book by Judy Blume about a teenager's discovery of her sexuality, including wet dreams, masturbation, and menstruation. All of these things are really not a big deal in the internet age because all that information is readily available. But when the book was the only game in town, it was kept a strong eye on. So, what then is the future of books? Where can we say that books are headed? Well, it's really tough to know, but we do know that electronic forms of books are going to continue to increase as the public continues to gain an appetite for reading in that way. And that's why this book I made available online as well. Books, as you know, that are online, they save paper, they're cheaper, but they don't have the feel of the book. So, and there are other problems like batteries going dead or cords going bad for reading a book. All things that get in the way when you use electronics. One thing that we do know for certain about the future of books is there will be more printing on demand. And what that means is in the past, book publishers would print a whole bunch of copies in advance. For example, my book, Comparing Media from Around the World, had a first run of 3,500 copies. Now, we never got to a second run, but they printed all those copies now. Now those copies have to be sold before another round goes. Printing on demand is possible today because of the internet, because of so many more people are producing books, so many more editors, so many more writers. So my book, The Rounding Some Corners, that's a book that is done by printing on demand. If a college orders that book for its FYE courses or for its Common Read program, if you know what that's all about at a university, then my publisher will print that many copies on demand. And that's what's possible today for books, which pretty much speeds up the process. Because once a book is out, right, you can't change it. It's permanent. That's why we have a 6th edition, a 7th edition, 8th edition, etc. But printing on demand is making it possible to make those changes without having to issue a whole new edition. So there we have it. We are finished discussing the book, and I hope that somewhere at some time, even if not now while you're in college in a pandemic, you do find a special fondness for reading and reading books. There is no other way to go through life with a kind of detailed, precise thinking to find a handle on your words than reading books. Have a great day.